Pete Hegseth walked into the Pentagon with a reputation as a fighter, but what unfolded under his watch left even his allies stunned. Within days of taking the job, reports claim he made a blunder so massive it stalled U.S. military aid to Ukraine at the height of Russia's assault, not because of sabotage, not because of battlefield losses, but because he allegedly misunderstood a single presidential comment. The result? Shipments of desperately needed weapons were turned around, millions of dollars were wasted, and soldiers on the front lines were left exposed. When Congress got wind of it, Representative Mikie Sherrill didn't hold back. She accused Hegseth not of minor missteps but of chaos, incompetence, and reckless judgment.
The Pentagon, I have to say, your training at Fox News has let you spin months of dangerous dysfunction and incompetence into catchy phrases like restoring the warrior ethos and increasing lethality. But the truth is, it's really been chaos at the Pentagon under your leadership. You've clearly shown you're unable to manage the Department of Defense, but what I'm most concerned about are three specific areas: your operational incompetence, your managerial incompetence, and your budgetary incompetence. So let's start with operational. According to news reports, in your first week on the job, you got confused in a National Security Council meeting and thought President Trump wanted you to stop all aid to Ukraine. In a well-functioning administration, you would have asked for clarification before making that seismic policy shift, but instead you ordered vital military aid heading to the front lines turned around, costing the U.S. millions of dollars and depriving Ukrainian soldiers of equipment they needed to fight Russia. So, Mr. Secretary, can you explain how exactly you misunderstood such a monumental presidential order?
One of many fake news headlines we've dealt with.
So President Trump told you to halt military aid to Ukraine on January 30th?
As is often the case, highly ideological and very ill-informed reporters love to speculate about things they know nothing about in order to smear President Trump and myself.
So it sounds like actually the reporting is correct, because I will say, if it wasn't a mistake, why did aid restart only a few days later?
Again, we would take complete issue with what would some call reporting and others call a hatchet job.
So why did aid start just a couple days later?
I'm saying the reporting is inaccurate, ma'am.
I don't think that's correct. So let's move on to your managerial incompetence. I think we can see why you misunderstood the president, because you're obviously misunderstanding my questions. Less than a month into the job, you fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, C.Q. Brown, and the chief of naval operations, Lisa Franchetti, without cause. And to this day, you still have not provided an adequate explanation for removing them. As far as I can tell, you fired C.Q. Brown because he was black and Lisa Franchetti because she is a woman. So nearly 4 months later, we still don't have a new nominee for Chief of Naval Operations. News reports, and you can contest it, but I'd love to hear your answer, say that you haven't nominated someone because qualified admirals keep turning the position down. So tell me, Mr. Secretary, when will Congress receive your nomination for the next chairman of the next Chief of Naval Operations?
Ma'am, with all due respect, I would suggest not believing every headline you read.
With all due respect, I'd like your nomination. When will we see it?
There had not a single admiral or any military official has turned down a position that's been.
So when will we see your nominee for the Chief of Naval Operations?
In due time, for all the right reasons.
Again, I think we've seen the managerial incompetence. Okay, let's move on to budgetary incompetence. You missed the deadline to submit a draft defense budget to Congress, which makes it impossible for us to complete our work on the NDAA or appropriations, and makes it more likely you'll receive delays in funding you need for new acquisitions, programs, and other priorities. Additionally, you're blowing money on poorly conceived operations and vanity projects for President Trump. Retrofitting the Qatari jet to serve as Air Force One will cost about $400 million. The parade in D.C. this weekend will cost upwards of $40 million. Your bombing campaign in Yemen cost about $1 billion, and a week later they were having missile strikes in Israel. Your operations in L.A. will cost tens of millions of dollars, and you claim to be cutting costs at the Pentagon, but all I see are wasted dollars better spent addressing our most pressing threats like China. So, Mr. Secretary, what priorities have you cut funding for to pay for these projects?
Ma'am, I would just say your list left off securing the southern border.
So, Mr. Secretary, what priorities have you cut funding for to pay for these projects?
We make trade-offs every day, and I would imagine what we want to spend on is quite different than what the previous administration did.
Well, I think
Made
the American
those changes quickly, and they're reflected in this budget, and we're very proud of them.
I think the American people can see why I'm so concerned about this incompetence.
And what followed wasn't a hearing, it was a demolition. From the very start, Pete Hegseth's tenure was marked by confusion that quickly turned into catastrophe. According to multiple reports, in his first week at the Pentagon, he misread a directive during a high-level security meeting and ordered a halt to vital military aid bound for Ukraine. Instead of pausing to clarify, he acted immediately, redirecting shipments of weapons, ammunition, and protective gear that were already en route to soldiers fighting Russian forces on the front lines. The cost wasn't just financial, though the losses ran into the millions. The real damage was the delay. Ukrainian troops waiting in trenches were suddenly cut off, left without the support they had been promised. And when asked about the decision later, Hegseth brushed it off as fake headlines and speculation. But here's the question that refuses to go away: if it wasn't a mistake, why did the aid resume only a few days later? This single blunder set the tone for everything that came after. And as shocking as it was, Representative Mikie Sherrill made clear it was only the beginning. Pete Hegseth didn't come to the Pentagon as a career strategist or a decorated planner, he came with a background in television. And Representative Mikie Sherrill wasted no time pointing out the problem. In her words, Hegseth had mastered the art of soundbites but not the skill of leadership. Phrases like restoring the warrior ethos and increasing lethality may have sounded good on cable news, but behind the slogans was nothing but dysfunction. Instead of order, there was chaos. Instead of clear priorities, there were distractions and deflections. The Pentagon under his leadership wasn't being steered with vision, it was being packaged like a media segment, with catchy lines that fell apart the moment anyone looked deeper. Sherrill accused him of turning months of turmoil into rehearsed talking points. And with each answer he gave, the image of a leader in control collapsed even further. But the sharpest blows weren't about slogans. They were about the people he pushed out of the Pentagon's highest ranks and the silence that followed. If Hegseth's handling of military aid raised eyebrows, what he did next set off alarm bells. Barely weeks into his role, he abruptly dismissed two of the most senior officers in the country, General C.Q. Brown, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral Lisa Franchetti, chief of naval operations. No clear explanation was given, no national security crisis demanded it, and no replacement plan was ready. Representative Mikie Sherrill didn't mince words. She accused Hegseth of removing Brown because he was black and forcing out Franchetti because she was a woman. Her statement landed like a thunderclap inside the hearing room. This wasn't about disagreements over policy, this was an accusation of identity-based purges at the very top of America's military leadership. And when pressed, Hegseth offered no real defense. He didn't deny it. He didn't provide a credible reason. He simply stalled, insisting decisions would be explained in due time. But for Sherrill and for Congress, that silence said it all. The purge was only the start, because what followed wasn't just a leadership shakeup, it was a vacuum that left the Pentagon drifting without direction. The dismissals might have shocked Washington, but what came next was even more alarming: a leadership vacuum at the highest levels of the military. Months after the firings, there was still no confirmed nominee for Chief of Naval Operations. Reports suggested qualified admirals were quietly declining the job, unwilling to step into an environment many described as chaotic and unstable. Representative Mikie Sherrill pressed the issue directly. She didn't ask politely, she demanded answers. When will Congress see your nominee? The response from Hegseth was evasive at best. He insisted the decision would come in due time, offering nothing more. For a Pentagon that depends on clear chains of command and decisive leadership, those words rang hollow. The longer the position stayed vacant, the more glaring the cracks became. Allies abroad and commanders at home were left wondering who was steering the ship. And to Sherrill, this wasn't just indecision, it was proof of a manager out of his depth. But if the leadership vacuum was bad, the next revelation would paint an even darker picture. Because beyond the missed decisions and stalled nominations, there was the question of money and where billions of taxpayer dollars were really going. If the leadership crisis wasn't enough, the budget told an even more troubling story. One of the Pentagon's most basic responsibilities is to submit a draft defense budget on time, yet under Hegseth's watch, that deadline was missed. The consequence was immediate. Congress couldn't begin its work on appropriations or finalize the National Defense Authorization Act, leaving critical programs hanging in limbo. But Sherrill went further, accusing him of not just failing to plan but actively wasting billions. She listed what she called vanity projects that drained resources away from America's most urgent priorities. A retrofitted jet turned into a luxury transport at a price tag of $400 million. A military parade in Washington costing upwards of $40 million, a bombing campaign abroad that devoured nearly $1 billion in just 1 week, producing little to no strategic gains. Meanwhile, pressing threats, China's growing military power, cyber vulnerabilities, and new global conflict zones were left underfunded and underprioritized. The contrast was impossible to ignore, lavish spending on spectacles, while the core mission of defense grew weaker. Sherrill's point was clear. The problem wasn't simply numbers on a spreadsheet, it was judgment. And her final question cut through the noise: what priorities have you cut to pay for these projects? By the end of her questioning, Mikie Sherrill had connected the dots into a devastating conclusion. This wasn't about isolated errors or a few bad choices, it was a pattern of dysfunction, operational confusion that halted critical aid, a purge of top leaders that left the Pentagon unstable, a budget process in shambles with billions poured into projects that did little to strengthen national security. Her words cut through the usual political spin: operational incompetence, managerial incompetence, and budgetary incompetence. 3 failures, all pointing to one man. Behind every slogan and every catchphrase was a trail of chaos that put both America's credibility and global security at risk. And perhaps most striking, she made clear the cost wasn't just measured in dollars, it was measured in soldiers left waiting for supplies that never came, in allies questioning America's reliability, and in the growing sense that leadership at the very top had collapsed. But this wasn't just a critique, it was a warning. If such dysfunction could take root so quickly, what would happen if it continued unchecked? What unfolded in that hearing wasn't routine oversight, it was a rare moment where the mask slipped, and the dysfunction inside the Pentagon was laid bare. Mikie Sherrill didn't rely on vague critiques or partisan jabs. She laid out a case built on facts, reports, and failures that spoke for themselves. The picture she painted was damning. A Pentagon paralyzed by operational confusion, senior leaders dismissed without cause, leaving gaping holes in command. A budget process derailed, with billions wasted on projects that served appearances more than strategy. And through it all, the people paying the highest price weren't in Washington conference rooms, they were soldiers in the field, allies abroad, and taxpayers at home. In just a few minutes of relentless questioning, Sherrill turned what could have been another scripted hearing into a demolition of leadership. And the warning at the heart of it was impossible to ignore. When power is handled with recklessness instead of responsibility, it isn't the officials in suits who suffer first, it's the men and women depending on them. The question now is simple: how long can America afford to tolerate that kind of chaos at the top?